Welcome to the Narrate podcast, where we aim to tell God's story with our lives. We'll be continuing to post the Sunday message each week, but we want to dive a little deeper and offer some content to supplement your life with God, and that's where our Beyond Sunday series comes in. Join Adam and Narrate staff as they provide thoughtful discussions, ideas, and interviews that go beyond the message you'll hear on Sunday.
Hi Narrate, this is Hannah. As some of you know by now, I have entered into the process to be ordained as clergy in C4SO. So it feels really big, exciting, and definitely like the next right step for me. As part of the ordination process, I needed to write what is called a spiritual autobiography. So this is basically a story of one's life, and it demonstrates how God has shown up in the people, events, and places in my story. So it kind of tracks God's thread and movements throughout my life, demonstrating how we've gotten to this point. God has guided me and shaped me, formed me into the person I am today, and part of that is being called into ordained ministry. So for today, I'm going to read my spiritual autobiography for you. We thought this might be the best way to get this information out. And so what follows just is my story, and I think proof that God tells long stories as well. It's difficult for me to recall the exact time or place where I first became aware of following Jesus. In fact, it might be more accurate to say that I really don't remember a time in my life before Jesus. I was raised in a somewhat Christian household. My mom was and is to this day a Christ follower. My dad was not, and I don't think would identify as a Christ follower today. So my mom took my sister and I to a Lutheran church every Sunday, and we regularly attended Sunday school and the worship services. So as part of the Lutheran tradition, I was baptized as an infant. I later went through the confirmation process, and I was confirmed in 8th grade. And I just have to say, too, I enjoyed my Lutheran upbringing. I enjoyed the experience I had in the Lutheran church. And I kind of look back at it now as this place that gave me a really solid foundation at the start of my life, and has really shaped and formed who I've grown into today. And so I do really honor that experience. During high school, my church attendance became sporadic. When my parents divorced my senior year of high school, it was about that time I quit attending church altogether. I would say I still believed in God, and I never doubted his existence, but I believed he didn't really care. As a result, I chose not to include him in my life for several years. I grieved my parents' divorce mainly in isolation from God and others. I just didn't want to let the people around me in too deeply. Soon after, I left for college at Montana State University in Bozeman, and I tried to embrace the typical college experience. A few months in, I became friends with a girl on my dorm floor named Jocelyn. She was a Christian, and she regularly attended these various Christian groups on campus, and she would always invite me. I declined for quite a while, but I really enjoyed her friendship and eventually realized that if I wanted to spend time with her, I was going to have to attend at least a few of these groups. She practically spent every evening at one. One evening at an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship gathering, we were asked to pair up and pray with each other. I began looking for the nearest exit. Stuff like this was just too weird for me. But Jocelyn grabbed my hand and she said she would pray for me. As she prayed for me, I heard a voice telling me that I was loved. I understood that to be God's voice, because he said he wanted a relationship with me. It didn't matter that I ignored him or had turned my back for years. God still wanted a relationship with me. He invited me to follow him. And it was really in those early months of 2011, I made a decision to really give following Christ another chance. I wish I could remember like the day or the month. I'm so bad at remembering specifics of like timelines, but I do remember it was the early months of 2011 that I really like gave following Jesus another shot. I jumped in wholeheartedly. I began attending Journey Church in Bozeman. I went to weekly InterVarsity gatherings, and I also attended a Bible study in my dorm. So that happened throughout the first and middle part of 2011. I returned to MSU in the fall of 2011 with a new roommate, Margaret. We became friends, but early on in our friendship, she shared with me that her friends had warned her to avoid people like me, Christians. When I asked why, she explained that Christians were always trying to recruit people to join their groups. I responded that, well, it was the beginning of the school year. Literally every group on campus is doing the same thing. She thought about that and accepted that as a fair point. And we didn't talk about faith very much at first. Each summer, InterVarsity, this group I had become a part of, they send a group of students to Kenya for a short-term mission trip called a Global Project. Several of my friends went in the summer of 2011 and returned claiming changed lives and renewed energy in God and faith. I was really skeptical. Could 2 months overseas really have that kind of impact? This is how I know God has a sense of humor, because Kenya, literally a country I had never thought about, I don't think I could locate it on a globe at this point, suddenly began showing up everywhere. From my sociology of religion classes, in random conversations, and even on the reality TV show my roommate was watching. I began to feel that I needed to go, believing it would be where I would fully learn to trust in God and make my faith my own. I reluctantly signed up for the following year's trip and was not surprised in the least when I got accepted. It would not be an understatement to say that the summer of 2012 in Kenya changed the trajectory of my life. So you're there for 2 months. This is the format of the trip. And then you're with the large group of about 30 or 40 students for most of the time. But for 3 weeks in the middle, you get sent out in pairs all across Kenya for what's called your 3-week ministry assignment. So you get paired up with a partner, go all out over Kenya, and I thought I was going to get sent somewhere cool that looked like a safari magazine. Absolutely not. I was placed in the Korogocho slums, just on the outskirts of Nairobi, the last place I wanted to go. During that time, my partner and I ministered alongside the local pastor to the people in the community. And I experienced God's presence, strength, and guidance in ways I had never felt prior. Being removed from my familiar context and culture without my usual comforts, routines, foods, or relationships forced me to rely on God in a new way. It was as though I needed to be completely disoriented in order to be fully oriented toward God. And while there were several experiences from that time that I could talk about, one experience stands out very clearly. One day we were visiting members of the pastor's church. We were praying with them. We entered a small shack that was home to a single woman with several children. And her prayer request was heartbreaking. She didn't have enough money to send all of her kids to school and to the doctor. And she wanted clarity on really which children she should prioritize, which children she should spend her money on. Now, I was 21 years old at the time, and I remember thinking she couldn't have been much older than I was. As other people prayed, I found myself a little distracted, and I was reflecting on how my life was so blessed. First, I had a plane ticket out of here, back home, in just a couple of weeks. And I was going back to a comfortable, familiar life. What had I done to deserve this life of mine? It wasn't perfect or luxurious by any means, but my life was pretty great in many different ways. It was in that moment, in this tiny little shack in the middle of a slum, that I heard a voice. And this voice was not my own. But I heard this voice saying to me, "You have done nothing. I realized I hadn't earned my life or my privileges, my comforts, or the things that I had. I was not better, more blessed, or more deserving than this single mother living in the slums. With these new insights, the question then became, how was I going to live differently? How was I going to live in a way that honored where I was born, the family I was born into, the resources I had, the gifts and skills that God had uniquely given me, and the people around me that God has brought into my life? In the days and weeks that followed, it became clear that moving forward, my life would be centered on God. I didn't quite know what that meant or what that would even look like, but I had to trust it might become clearer in time. How might God one day make this moment make sense? Would that ever happen? Would I even know the answer to that question this side of eternity? I would need to wait, be patient, and just understand how God would use this moment moving forward. And yes, God really can change the trajectory of your life in 2 months. There are so far 2, I would say, traumatic yet formative moments that stand out in my faith journey so far. I'm not naive to think that there won't be more as life goes on. But the first was my parents' divorce, which led me to turn away from God and others. Yet it was still formative, and I grew a lot. The second event occurred on January 6th, 2013. While I was at home on Christmas break, I had received a phone call from Jocelyn's mom one night. Although I had never met her mom, Jocelyn and I had become really close friends in the couple of years since that night she prayed over me. Her mom told me that Jocelyn had been killed in a car accident that afternoon while driving back to school for the spring semester. I was devastated. I began calling our mutual friends, informing them of this terrible news. The next morning, I knew I had to get back to Bozeman as soon as possible to be with friends and community. And those initial weeks after her death were brutal. However, we grieved as a community. We laughed and cried, sharing stories of our incredible friend. And while the grief was, and is, as you can probably hear, deep and painful, I learned a lot being surrounded by friends and community who supported one another, who loved one another, and we really felt God's presence in the grief with us. And while that was a really terrible event, I would say it formed and shaped just my understanding of how God is present with us even in our darkest times. My roommate Margaret was one of those incredibly supportive and close friends. We were roommates on and off from 2011 to 2016 until we both got married that same summer. Our friendship has grown and changed over the years, and to this day remains an incredibly deep and meaningful friendship. I cannot attempt to sum up this long, winding, and beautiful friendship as quickly as I would need to, but looking back, it's so clear God placed us in each other's lives. We both have needed each other's gifts and presence, insights and wisdom at crucial times in our lives. And during the early years of our friendship, God used me as this influence in Margaret's life. She eventually began following Jesus and has her own beautiful faith story to share. Later, she would become a crucial part of my ordination journey. And I can't help but reflect on how kind it was of God to bring this friendship full circle into the present. And she plays a really important part in my ordination story. Oh my goodness, y'all, we are only in the spring of 2013. I graduated from MSU with a degree in psychology and sociology. In 2014, I spent 6 months in Kenya working at a post-secondary vocational school. I then moved back to Bozeman, where I worked for Love Inc., which is a Christian nonprofit. They strive to mobilize churches and volunteers to help people in need in the community. Scott and I got engaged during that time, and in June of 2016, we got married in Bozeman and moved right away to Helena. There's so much I could write about Scott. He's incredible. I could write a ton about our friendship, which developed into a relationship leading to marriage. His support, genuine care, and heart for service and generosity has and continues to lead me closer to God's heart each and every day. He continually helps me to be more oriented toward Christ, and I could not have picked a more deeply humble and caring man to share in life's journeys. Scott moved to Helena about 6 months before I did to begin work at American Chemet. And based on several recommendations from the staff at Journey Church, we considered attending Narrate. Now, if you know Scott, he just jumps in. He quickly became involved in student ministry. And when I moved to Helena, we began attending Narrate, and we both loved the gatherings. Because one of our life mottos is just say yes, we instantly tried to become more and more involved. I also began applying for jobs in my field of psychology and sociology, and I was intentionally avoiding ministry or Christian nonprofit work. I had been there, I had done that, but despite my best efforts, I was having no luck. One day, I was job searching from our couch, from our very first apartment on the west side of town, and I had this strong sense from God that a job was going to come to me. Weird. And though it felt strange, it was like July, and it was beautiful outside. I slammed my computer shut, and I spent the next several weeks exploring Helena and hiking and just getting my bearings around town. One afternoon, I received a text from someone I'd met through Narrate who mentioned a job opening that she thought I would be interested in. I didn't want to work for a church, though, but it was the first personal connection around a potential job. So I figured I should go with it. Maybe this would eventually lead to my job. I emailed Adam to ask about this position of hospitality and assistant scattering director. The job seemed like a great fit, even though I felt really underqualified. I applied. I assumed I would not be hired. But as the process continued, Scott and I entered into many conversations around what work in ministry might entail for ourselves, our new marriage, and our lifestyle. Is this kind of how we wanted to shape and form our life this early on? In the end, we decided I should apply for the job. And to my surprise, I was actually hired, and I really loved the work. I enjoy getting to work with people, volunteers, and helping individuals serve our community. I wasn't sure if this was my long-term path, and I felt drawn towards some sort of graduate education. I always envisioned myself going back to grad school, and getting a master's or doctorate in something. I love school, and so I was just imagined I would go back to school at some point in my life. Of course, because I have a terrible memory, I'm now unclear on the specifics, but somewhere in late 2017, Adam mentioned to me that Narrate would be supportive if I chose to attend seminary. Interesting, but seminary, not exactly what I had in mind. Remember, I didn't really want to work for a church or in ministry, but I began praying about this idea. One day, I was just praying about this opportunity to go to graduate school. It looked a little different than what I was thinking, but here was this opportunity. And it was that morning God showed me an image of a door cracked open with light spilling through. I understood this as an invitation to say yes, even if I didn't yet know where it might lead. I began attending Portland Seminary online through George Fox University in the fall of 2018. I love learning, and I enjoyed the discussions, along with traveling to Portland each semester for in-person classes. Such good food, let me say. It took me a while. Actually, it took me 5 years going part-time, and eventually reached the spring of 2023, graduated with a master's in ministry. I was so excited to just take a year off of the late nights, all of the reading, writing papers, but I committed to 1 year of just prayerful discernment. What's going to come next, God? I had no idea what, if anything, might come next, but I thought, give myself a year and just see what happens. In the fall of 2024, I was invited to enroll in the Anglican Foundation's program through C4SO. While enrolled in these courses, I also attended the C4SO Clergy Conference in Kansas City in May of 2025. After spending several days with the incredible people and leaders of C4SO, it was then I felt God sort of tapping me on the shoulder, indicating that this may be the path forward. I remember sitting in part of attending the clergy conference alongside of workshops and different breakout sessions was attending the ordination service. And it was really in sitting in that service or ceremony, whatever you want to call it, I really felt at that point entering into this space, I had no imagination for ordination for myself or that this was even something I might pursue. And it was really sitting in that service that God stirred up something in me that said, I think this is the next path for you. Like, this may be your journey forward. Now, ordination, like I said, wasn't something I had seriously considered, but the cracked door was beginning to open just a tad. I committed because I'm a slow processor, slow adopter. I told myself to commit to finishing out the rest of these Anglican Foundation courses. And I finished those in late November of 2025. So next came the season of Advent, and I asked Scott to enter into a really intentional time during Advent of prayer and fasting with me around this idea of ordination. And it was really during that time I felt a strong calling that this was indeed the next step God was calling me into. I remember specifically, there's a couple instances I could talk about, but one day I was fasting and I was actually printing and stapling the papers for our noon daily office prayer that we do at 326. And I found myself doubting. Once again, I was falling into this mind frame of questioning, am I even called to this? Was I really called into ministry? Maybe I'm making it up. Am I imagining this? What does it even feel like to be called? Like, maybe I'm just making all of this up. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, I was really, y'all, out of nowhere. I was instantly taken back to this single mother's hut in the middle of the Korogocho slum on the outskirts of Nairobi. I remembered that sense that I would be called to live my life differently, one with God at the center. And at that time, in 2012, I didn't know what that might look like or how that would come to be. I would just need to continue moving forward, saying yes to God's invitations along the way. And it was in that moment God whispered to me, "And you don't think you're called?" Wow. God is faithful and tells long stories if we are willing to listen and join him. As you may be able to tell, self-doubt is a lingering weakness of mine. I'm embarrassed to admit. But that Wednesday, that very same evening that I just had this experience with God, I was back to doubting. I know, right? Ugh. It's so frustrating that that's such a weakness of mine. But anyway, so the next morning, I woke up to a text message from Margaret, totally unprompted. Now, to be clear, we are still really good friends, but we are not in each other's daily or even weekly lives. At this point, I hadn't talked to her in a while, and she had no idea that I was deep in this discernment process on ordination, and I was having all of these thoughts of self-doubt. Like she had no way of knowing this. And that very same day, her text message from late the night before, and again, totally unprompted, we hadn't talked in several weeks, said this. She said, "I'm not sure what you're feeling, but I feel compelled to let you know, however you're feeling, you need to go with it." She told me to move forward, head on, and let God do his best work. God was so incredibly kind to give me one more nudge or literal text message, leading me right back to him. The crack in the door continues to widen. And that kind of brings us up to, when am I recording this? February 4th, 2026. And I am still in the process. The ordination process takes many months to over a year. And so I am attempting to just faithfully continue to say yes and fulfill this process. And I guess that brings us up to where we're at. So to kind of continue on, there's about another page, and they just ask you to write about your spiritual disciplines and practices. So my spiritual disciplines and practices center on beginning each day in quiet time and reflection. That can look different throughout the seasons of life, but that usually includes reading my Bible or listening to the Bible, journaling, praying for people in our community. I do love some good solitude, silence, or centering prayer. A quote that continually brings me back to thinking about spiritual practices and disciplines comes from James K.A. Smith. "Your deepest desire is the one manifested in your daily life and habits." And I believe that my daily life and habits and behavior should reflect a life lived with Christ. Most days don't come with big aha moments, and that's okay. For me, spiritual formation and my practices in this season look a lot like attempting to prioritize time with God, reading the Bible, actually trying to listen to what God might have to say, and being okay with silence, and then simply going about my day, offering the gifts God has given me to the people I'm called to serve, the people who I'm honored to do life with, and the people I'm blessed to be around and serve. So in reflecting on my work in ministry, I definitely wouldn't leave out missions in Kenya. I loved my time at InterVarsity, and also enjoyed my time spent at Love Inc. Those experiences, especially my global project to Kenya, are valued and very formative to me. Narrate hired me in 2016 as the hospitality director to oversee Sunday morning teams and assist in planning scattering events. And I still perform those tasks. I really love those tasks. And over the last 9.5 years, my role has continued to evolve into one that is maybe more accurately reflected by the title of associate pastor. Like I said, I still lead our Sunday morning hospitality team, which I love. I love being a part of creating an environment that is friendly and welcoming, where people can show up and feel like they belong and that they matter and that they're cared about. I love planning our scattering events and helping you all serve our community in creative and fun, unique ways. I might add things like meeting with people, networking with other nonprofits or people in our community. I've actually really enjoyed teaching about, 6 times a year. I love getting to spend time learning and share with y'all what I've learned. I would add to that assisting in baptisms, and we've got a great team of pastors and leaders at Narrate that I'm just honored to be a part of. So as we wrap up, I continue to struggle with self-doubt and attempt to lean into God's desire for my life. And I do feel called to continue pursuing ordination within C4SO. And it's so interesting writing my spiritual autobiography. It's my story. But even as I write it and reflect it and read it to you today, it's so interesting to see throughout the course of my life how God has invited me into relationships, ministries, trainings, classes, opportunities, traumatic events, friendships. All of these have shaped me and formed me into the person I am today. I believe God is calling me to affirm a life in ministry, to serve God and others faithfully. I did not seek ordination, but rather God sought after me and laid it out for me, guiding and prompting me the entire way. All I did was say yes. And y'all, that's it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening to my story. And as always, if you need anything, please reach out. Thank you. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.